11 months after she knelt in the rain and pressed both hands into a stranger's ribs to keep the blood inside him, Nora Bennett stood in a private dining room full of men who had spent their entire lives being frightened of the wrong person. The chandeliers were dark. Only the service lamps burned, low and yellow, the way a kitchen looks at 4 in the morning when the world hasn't earned the day yet. Cesare Bruno sat at the head of a table he no longer owned, and he was the only man in the room sweating. Nora set a small white pastry box in front of him and slid it forward with 2 fingers, unhurried, the way she used to hand a stranger a birthday cake. "Open it," she said. "My father made you one exactly like this the week before you took everything he had." The morning it began, she had $11 in the register and a letter she had not opened for 3 days. Bennett and daughter sat on the crooked corner where Calder Street gave up and folded into Hanover, a narrow brick storefront with a green awning her father had painted himself in 1996 and never once repainted. Nora woke at 3:40 every morning without an alarm anymore. Her body simply surrendered to the schedule. By 4, she had the deck oven climbing. By 4:15, the first sheet of almond croissants proofing under damp cloth. And by 5, the smell had crawled out under the door and down the block the way it had for 30 years, so that the men unloading fish trucks 2 streets over could smell burnt sugar and think, without ever knowing why, of somebody's mother. She was 31 years old. She wore a size 22. She had spent most of her adult life being the person other people talked past on their way to someone thinner. The letter was from Copley Standard Bank, and she opened it at 5:10 while the second oven came up to temperature, because she had learned that bad news lands softer when your hands are busy. 61 days delinquent, a number in bold that had 4 digits more than anything she had ever held. And underneath, the phrase that had been chasing her family for 11 years like a dog that never got tired: acceleration of the note. Her mother's facility bill sat under it in the same stack. Margaret Bennett had good days and bad days, and, increasingly, days that were simply blank, and the blank ones cost the same as the good ones. $4,200 a month for a room with a window and a nurse who called her mother sweetheart and meant it. Nora had not missed a payment. She had missed rent, dental work, her own annual checkup, 3 winters of a coat that actually closed, and every reasonable chance at a life. But she had never missed that. Grace Molina came in at 5:30, shaking rain off a jacket that had stopped being waterproof around the time of the last mayoral election, and took one look at Nora's face and did not ask. "Thorne's coming at 9, Nora said. "Thorne can eat glass. Thorne can foreclose." Grace tied on her apron. "Then let him do it after the tasting. Let him do it after we've got the Prescott contract and he's got nothing to hold over you." The Prescott contract. 400 plates monthly for the Prescott Harbor Foundation's donor events, and the tasting was at 1 o'clock in a marble room on the Greenway. And Nora had spent money she did not have on butter she could not justify to make 11 desserts that would have made her father cry. Because here's what nobody in Boston remembered anymore. Thomas Bennett had been the best pastry man in the North End. Not the loudest, not the one with the magazine feature. The best. He had 2 shops and a wholesale line, and a habit of trusting people who shook his hand, and in the spring of Nora's 20th year, a supply company called Bruno Provisions had run 9 months of forged invoices through his books, flour and cocoa and Belgian couverture that never arrived, purchased with money that had never been clean. And when the state came looking for the seam in the fraud, they found her father's signature at the bottom of every page. He fought it for 2 years. He lost the second shop, then the first, then the house on Trenton Street, then his name. He died 4 months after the settlement, in a chair in the middle of an afternoon, with the crossword unfinished and the pen still kept. Nora had been in her 2nd year of nursing school. She left it in a week. She kept 1 shop out of the wreckage by begging refinancing and working herself into a shape that other people found easy to insult, and she had never once, not one single day, believed her father put his name to those invoices. She just had no way to prove it, and the man whose company had written them had gone on to become something the neighborhood only referred to obliquely in the past tense, as though he were weather. Gerald Thorne arrived at 9:02, shook the rain off an umbrella onto her clean floor, and did not sit down. Nora. He never used her surname. He used her surname with the men. I want to be a friend here. You want to be a friend with Aline. He smiled the way certain men smile when they have decided you are not going to be a problem. He was 50, sharply dressed in the way that costs a lot and communicates nothing. And he had been the senior credit officer who reviewed her father's file in 2014 and recommended against restructuring. She had never told him she knew that. She kept it the way you keep a knife in a drawer. There's a buyer for the corner, he said. Developer. 9 units above retail. They'd take the note off our books and you'd walk with something. Not nothing. Something. It isn't for sale. It isn't yours, is what it is. It's the bank's. You're just the one who wakes up early to look after it. He glanced at the case, at the trays, at her. His eyes did the small, ugly arithmetic she had been enduring since middle school, up, down, and back to her face with the conclusion already reached. Look after yourself for once. She said nothing. He left. The bell over the door rang cheerfully after him, and she thought, not for the first time, about tearing it down. The Prescott tasting was held in a room with 20-foot ceilings, white orchids, and a table so long it made the desserts look apologetic. Nora set out 11 plates. She had been awake for 11 hours. Her hands were steady and her chest hurt, and she talked them through each one in the plain, exact voice her father had used. The voice of a person who knows precisely how many degrees of hydration separate a good crumb from a great one. Eleanor Prescott tasted the chocolate and closed her eyes. That should have been the end of it. Then Camilla Ashford came in from the terrace with her phone in her hand and her coat still on, 60 seconds late in a way that was meant to be noticed, and took the seat nobody had offered her. Camilla chaired the gala. Camilla's family had been in Boston since there was a Boston, and her money was so old it had forgotten where it came from, and Nora had never met her before in her life. That was the part she kept turning over afterward. There was no history between them. There was no grudge. There was only a woman in a $900 coat deciding in about 4 seconds what kind of afternoon everyone was going to have. She looked at the 11 plates. She looked at Nora. She let the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable, and then let it stretch 2 seconds past that. Well, Camilla said, you certainly believe in the product. A laugh went around the table. Not a big one, the small kind. The kind that people cough into their fists. The kind that is worse. Eleanor, be serious. Our donors photograph everything. The whole point of the spring event is aspiration. She turned a fork over without picking anything up. You want the room to look at the dessert and want to be there. Not to look at the dessert and worry. Camilla, Eleanor Prescott said in a voice that was more embarrassment than objection. I'm being kind. I'm being useful. Camilla finally looked directly at Nora, and her expression was not hatred, which would at least have been an acknowledgement. It was mild. It was the face of a woman appraising a chair. Sweetheart, no one's saying you can't bake. But you are the advertisement. And you're advertising the wrong thing. Nora stood there in her clean white coat with flowers still in the creases of her knuckles, in a room where 12 people had just decided in unison not to look at her, and she felt the old furnace door swing open in her chest. That scalding familiar rush of shame that had been installed in her at 11 years old and topped up regularly ever since. She did not cry. She had learned that in the worst possible way. She said, the mousse has to be served at 54 degrees or the gelatin seizes. Whoever you hire won't tell you that. She stacked her boxes. Her hands did not shake until she was in the freight elevator, and then they shook so hard she had to put them under her arms. At 6 o'clock, Eleanor Prescott's assistant emailed to say the foundation had decided to go in a different direction. At 6:15, Gerald Dorn left a voicemail saying he hoped this made the conversation about the corner easier. By 9 that night, the rain had turned mean. Nora stayed late because the alternative was going home to a one-bedroom above a dry cleaner and thinking. She scaled out flour for morning. She scrubbed the mixer bowl to a shine nobody would ever see. At 20 past 11, she took the trash out through the back door into the alley off Calder, and that is when the world she had been living in ended and the other one started. He was against the wall by the recycling, sitting up, which was the only reason she saw him at all. Dark coat, dark hair plastered flat, one hand pressed under his left arm and the other flat on the wet brick beside him like a man steadying a boat. The rain had washed a long red thread of him out across the alley and into the drain. It was moving fast. That was the detail she noticed first, with 2 years of nursing school waking up in her spine like a slapped nerve. Not the blood, but its speed. Their eyes met. He did not ask for help. That was the second thing most people ask. He looked at her the way a wolf looks at a farmhouse, evaluating whether the light in the window is worth what it costs. And then he said very calmly in a voice with more gravel than volume, "Go back inside and lock the door." She should have. She has thought about that for the rest of her life. There was a version of Nora Bennett who went back inside and locked the door and sold the corner to a developer and moved to Quincy and lived a small, quiet life with an unpaid debt and an unavenged father. Instead, she said, "You'll be dead in 20 minutes. That's optimistic. Then you can be optimistic on my floor. Get up." He weighed 190 pounds of dead resistance, and she was strong. She had been hauling 50-pound sacks up cellar stairs since she was 14, and she got him through the back door and onto the stainless prep table, and she kicked the door shut with her heel and through the bolt, and then she did the thing she had trained for and never finished. 2 entry wounds. One through the meat of the left shoulder, clean, angry, survivable. One low under the ribs that worried her badly. She cut his shirt off with kitchen shears. She packed the low wound with gauze from a first aid kit that had been rated for burns and small cuts and had never in its life been asked to do this. She used a clean bar towel and her whole body weight to hold pressure while the deck oven cycled and hissed behind her, and the room filled with the incongruous, ridiculous smell of yesterday's caramel. "You're not calling an ambulance," he said. "Not a question. Would you let me?" "No." "Then I'm not." He laughed once, and it clearly cost him something, up close under the fluorescence. He was not a man you would ever describe as handsome without also describing something else. Black hair going gray at one temple. A face built out of straight lines. A scar that started at the hinge of his jaw and disappeared under the collar he no longer had. And eyes that stayed on her the entire time, tracking her hands, not with fear, with a kind of cold, precise curiosity, as if she were an equation that had not resolved. "You know what you're doing," he said. "I know enough. Where does a baker learn this? Where does a man in a $4,000 coat learn to sit still while he's bleeding into a storm drain?" Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Fair. Her hands were red to the wrist. She said, "What's your name?" "You already know it." And she did. She had known it since the door shut, the way you know a sound in the dark before you can name it. Every shopkeeper on Hanover Street knew it. Her father had known it. It was the name people used, a hand gesture for, instead of saying out loud. "Damiano Vitale," she said. "Nora Bennett," he answered, and the floor dropped out from under her because she had never told him. At 3 in the morning, 2 men came through her back door without knocking. The first was compact and gray-suited and perfectly dry, which suggested he had come from a car that had parked close. He took in the scene, the blood, the shears, the towels, the woman with her sleeves pushed to the elbow and both hands still pressed into his boss's ribs, and his face did something complicated. "He's stable," Nora said, because someone had to talk. "The shoulder's clean. The lower one didn't go through. He needs a real surgeon in the next 2 hours, or the next 2 hours won't matter." The gray suit looked at Damiano. "Enzo," Damiano said, "this is Miss Bennett. She has been holding me together with a dish towel since 11:30. Enzo Marchetti inclined his head about half an inch. From him, Nora would eventually learn. Half an inch was a standing ovation. The second man was younger and enormous and had the flat, unbothered eyes of someone for whom this was Tuesday. Vince Ricci carried Damiano out to the car like a rolled carpet, and Enzo stayed behind for 90 seconds, and in those 90 seconds he took a photograph of the alley with his phone, looked at her security camera, and said, "That record's to a hard drive, to a box in the cellar. May I?" It was not really a question. She gave him the box. He paused at the door. "You understand what you did tonight?" he said. "I stopped somebody from dying on my property." "No." Enzo Marchetti buttoned his coat. "You stopped 400 people from dying in the next 6 months. 2 of them would have been men I like." He looked around the kitchen. The cracked tile, the ancient mixer, the hand-painted sign propped against the wall waiting for a hook that had never gotten fixed. "Get some sleep, Miss Bennett. Tomorrow will be strange." Tomorrow was strange. At 6:15, a man she had never met delivered 40 pounds of Italian 00 flour she had not ordered and would not have been able to afford. At 9, the mixer that had been dying for 3 years was replaced by a new one, silently, by 2 people who declined coffee. At 11:40, Copley Standard Bank called to inform her, in a tone of tightly managed confusion, that her note had been purchased in full by a private party and that the account was now closed. At 2 in the afternoon, a black car stopped in front of the green awning and Enzo opened the door, and Nora, wearing flour and a t-shirt and no plan whatsoever, got in. They took her to a house in Winchester with a gravel drive and no visible neighbors, and Damiano Vitale received her in a room lined with books, seated colorless, with his left arm strapped and a blanket over his knees like an old man, which was the least believable thing she had ever seen. "Sit," he said. "Cancel it." "Which part?" "The note. The bank. All of it." Her voice came out harder than she intended, and she let it. "I've had people buy me things before. There's always a second half of the sentence." "There is." He gestured at the chair with 2 fingers. She sat. "The second half is, I don't like owing. I've spent 22 years arranging my life so that nobody can put a hand on my shoulder and remind me of something. Then a woman with flour on her arms holds my organs in and refuses to call an ambulance." He looked at her steadily. "So the debt is inconvenient. I'd like to discharge it. By paying my mortgage. By paying whatever you tell me the number is." And that was the moment. Nora would think about it later. Turning it over the way she turned over the last 4 seconds before Camilla Ashford opened her mouth. And she would understand that it was not the money, and it was certainly not the man. It was the door. She had spent 11 years standing outside a locked room where the truth about her father was kept hammering on it with the only tools an ordinary person is given. Lawyers she couldn't afford, records nobody would release, a police detective who had been polite and useless and retired to Florida. And here was a man who did not knock on doors. "I don't want the money," she said. "I want a name." Something changed in his face. Very small. The interest of a man who has been handed a variable he did not anticipate. Whose? In 2014, a supply company called Bruno Provisions ran 9 months of forged invoices through my father's wholesale accounts. $680,000 of product that never existed. My father went down for it. He lost 2 shops, his house, and his name. And then he died. She kept her hands flat on her knees so they would not do anything embarrassing. "I know what a real flour invoice looks like, Mr. Vitale. I've read those pages 400 times. They didn't come from my father's office. Somebody put them there. I want to know who signed off, who carried them, and who ordered it. And then I want to be in the room when it comes back on them." The clock in the hall counted out a long stretch of nothing. "You know who owns Bruno Provisions?" Damiano said at last. "Yes, and you're asking me anyway." "I'm asking you because—" She leaned forward. "You don't have to like it. You asked for a number. That's the number." He was quiet for so long that she began to prepare herself for the car ride back. Then he said, "Enzo." The door opened immediately, because Enzo Marchetti had never in his life been more than 1 wall away. "Pull everything on Bruno Provisions, 2012 to 2015. Shipping manifests, bank rails, who was couriering paper for them." A pause. "And find out who told 4 men where my car would be on Tuesday night. Somebody in my house set my route." Enzo's eyes flicked once to Nora, then away. "Yes, sir." The gala was 3 weeks later, and the invitation came from Damiano the way everything came from Damiano, presented as an option that had already happened. "The Prescott Harbor Spring Benefit," he said. "The Vitale interests have taken a table for 9 years. This year I'll be attending. Congratulations, with you." Nora set down her coffee. "Absolutely not. Miss Ashford chairs the committee. I'm aware. Miss Ashford's family holds 19% of a bank Cesare Bruno washes money through, and she has been engineering an introduction to me for 2 years. And she will be standing under the lights at the top of the stairs, greeting every guest personally." He said it without inflection, the way a man reads a weather report. "You can decline. I'll go alone, and it will accomplish nothing. Or you can walk in on my arm, and every person who watched you carry your boxes out of that room will have to shake your hand and smile." She was quiet. "I don't need to be avenged over a dessert table," she said finally. "No," Damiano agreed, "but you'd like to be." She hated how accurate that was. The stylist came to the house on a Thursday. Fabian Cross had a cloud of silver hair, a rolling rack, and the manner of a man who had spent his career telling women what to be sorry for. He circled Nora twice, made a small noise in his throat, and reached for something black. "We'll do a column. Long line, high neck, matte crepe, nothing catches the eye, and we take everything down here." A vague, dismissive gesture at her middle, and just let it disappear. Very editorial. Very quiet. "Quiet," Nora repeated. "Slimming, darling. It's the kindest thing a dress can do." "No." The voice came from the doorway. Damiano had come in without sound, which he always did, and he was looking at the black dress on Fabian's arm, the way another man might look at a rat in a pantry. "She isn't going to a funeral, and she isn't hiding," he said. "The point of the evening is that she is seen." Fabian laughed a little, uncertainly. "Mr. Vitale, with a figure like Miss Bennett's, the professional recommendation is always to. The professional recommendation is why the professional is leaving." Damiano's tone never rose. It never had to. "Take the rack. Don't come back." The dress that arrived on Saturday was oxblood. Deep, saturated, a red so dark it read almost black until she moved and the light broke over it. Heavy silk, cut close through the body with no apology anywhere in it. A neckline that admitted she had a chest. Sleeves that admitted she had arms. They were garnets for her ears and nothing for her throat. Because Damiano had looked at her once and said, "Your neck doesn't need help." When she came down the stairs, Vince Ritchie, who had not offered her a complete sentence in 3 weeks, took his hands out of his pockets, and Damiano Vitale looked up from his phone and forgot, visibly, for something like 2 full seconds, that he was holding it. "There," he said quietly. "Now you're the room." She had expected the Prescott Gala to feel like a battle. It felt like a coronation nobody had scheduled. They came in at 8:40 late enough that the receiving line was still standing and the photographers were still awake, and the sound of the room did not stop so much as thin, the way a stove sounds when the gas cuts. People turned and then hurriedly pretended they hadn't, which is a distinct and delicious sound of its own. Camilla Ashford was at the top of the stairs in ice blue, exactly as promised, one hand extended toward Damiano before she had entirely registered who was on his arm. Nora watched her face through the whole journey. Delight, confusion, recalculation. And then, at the bottom, something almost like fear. Because Camilla had spent her life being fluent in the arithmetic of who mattered, and she had just gotten a sum she could not make come out. "Mr. Vitale," she said, "what an enormous... You've met Miss Bennett." Damiano did not shake her hand. "I." Camilla's smile stayed exactly where it was and stopped meaning anything. "Of course. The pastry." "The pastry," Nora agreed pleasantly. "Your committee declined her," Damiano said, still in that unhurried conversational register, and the 4 people standing nearest went very still. "You told her she was advertising the wrong thing. You said it in front of 11 people, and one of them repeated it to me verbatim, and I've thought about it several times since." He looked at Camilla with an attention so complete it was nearly violent. "You have a talent for finding the softest part of a person in under a minute. I want you to understand that I noticed it, and that I am the sort of man who writes things down." He moved on. He did not raise his voice once. Behind them, Nora heard Camilla Ashford try to start a sentence twice. Later, on the terrace, in the cold, with the harbor throwing broken light around, Nora said, "You marked her." "I did." "Why?" Damiano leaned on the rail with his good arm. Under the strings of bulbs, his face looked less like architecture and more like a man's. "My mother cleaned houses in Revere," he said. "She was a big woman. Loud. She laughed like somebody knocking over furniture. When I was 9, a client's wife told her, in front of me, in the kitchen, in the middle of a Tuesday, that she was too heavy to be trusted around the children's food." He turned his glass slowly. "My mother apologized. That's the part I couldn't get past. She apologized, and she went home, and she cried in the bathroom with the water running so I wouldn't hear it. And then she made dinner." Nora didn't say anything. "I've done things you'd have opinions about," he said. "I don't expect absolution, and I'm not asking for it. But I've never in my life been able to sit still while somebody makes a woman small for sport." He looked over. "You didn't apologize. I stacked my boxes." "You stacked your boxes," he agreed. "And then 8 hours later you kept me alive on a prep table. I've been trying for 3 weeks to decide which of those two things I find more alarming." The rain came in fine off the water. She was cold, and she did not move. The first strike landed 9 days after that, and Nora threw it herself. Enzo brought her a banker's box at 6 in the morning. Bruno Provisions shipping manifests, 26 months of them, pulled from a freight brokerage that had gone under in 2017 and whose records had been sitting in a warehouse in Everett since. He set them on her flower bench and said, "Our people looked. It's clean. Your people aren't bakers." She read for 11 hours with the proofing rack humming beside her, and at 5 past 5 in the afternoon she found it, and she laughed out loud in an empty room. "Here," she told them that night, spreading 4 pages across Damiano's table. March 2013. Bruno Provisions bills my father for 400 kilos of Valrhona at wholesale. Fine. Except the freight manifest for the same shipment lists a gross weight of 110 kilos, and cocoa doesn't evaporate. She slid the next page over. It's in 51 invoices. The paper always says one number, and the truck always says another. My father never checked freight weights, because who does? But somebody built the fraud on the assumption that nobody in the world would ever put these 2 documents side by side. Salvatore Conti, who had come in for the meeting and had spent it looking at Nora as though she were an unusual coin, said, "Who signed the freight side?" "Nobody." "The receiving initials are illegible. Then it proves the shipments were short, not who ordered it." "No," Nora said, "but it proves the invoices are lies, which means my father's signature is on a lie, which means the state's case is on a lie. And there's one man alive who reviewed those exact pages and recommended the bank foreclose anyway." She looked up. Gerald Thorne. He was the credit officer. He had both document sets in the file. He had them and he signed off, because Bruno Provisions was moving $40 million a year through his desk and he wasn't going to be the man who slowed it down. Damiano turned a page with one finger. "You want him. I want him first." They took Gerald Thorne apart in 11 days, and the beautiful thing, the thing Nora let herself feel proud of in a way she would not have admitted out loud, was that they never touched him. Enzo's accountants assembled the loan file. Nora wrote the summary herself, plainly the way you write a recipe so that anyone could follow it. Salvatore Conti made 2 phone calls to a former assistant United States attorney who owed the Vitale family a favor so old it had a beard. And the whole package went to the regional office of the bank's regulator on a Tuesday, and to a business reporter at the Globe on a Wednesday. On the Friday, Copley Standard placed Gerald Thorne on administrative leave. On the Monday, the story ran with his photograph. On the Thursday, Eleanor Prescott resigned from the Harbor Foundation board because it turned out the foundation had accepted 11 years of donations from an entity whose funding traced back through the same rails. and Eleanor had personally signed the acknowledgement letters. Camilla Ashford's engagement to a Bruno cousin was quietly not announced, and Gerald Thorne came to the bakery. He came at 8 in the evening, unshaven, in a coat he hadn't buttoned, and stood in the middle of the floor where he had once dripped rain on her tile. "You did this. You did this," Nora said, "in 2014. I just found it. They're going to indict me. I know. I have a daughter." Nora came around the counter and stopped in front of him, and she was not gentle. And she was not sorry, and she was aware for the first time in her life that she was the more dangerous person in a room. "So did my father," she said. Chair Bruno's answer came 4 nights later, and it came for her mother. The call reached Nora at 9:50. A man had presented himself at the memory care facility in Medford as a nephew, with paperwork, at an hour when the desk was thin. He had been turned away by a night nurse who did not like his shoes. He had left without arguing. Nora stood in her kitchen with the phone against her ear and understood with total clarity and no panic at all that a line had been drawn and that she was going to spend the rest of her life on the far side of it. Margaret Bennett was moved that night. Vince Ricci sat outside her new room for 11 weeks and learned, eventually, to play gin badly enough that a woman with a failing memory could beat him. Then, 6 days later, they came for Nora. He arrived at 4:50 in the morning in the uniform of a bakery supply company with a hand truck and 2 sacks of flour and a clipboard, at exactly the hour when the back door on Calder Street was propped for the morning delivery. It was a good plan. It was nearly a perfect plan. He got 2 steps inside before Nora looked up from the bench, and every hair on her body stood at once. Because the delivery driver for Coastal Mill was named Danny, and Danny had a bad knee and a Bruins tattoo and 4 grandchildren, and this man was not Danny, and on the back of the stranger's right hand, running from the knuckle to the wrist, was a healing burn, the exact mark a hot casing leaves when it ejects into the web of a shooter's hand, which Nora knew because she had cleaned an identical mark off Damiano's forearm with a bar towel on the worst night of her life. He set down the hand truck. He said, "Morning." Nora said, "You're early," and turned toward the deck oven and picked up the steam wand. Her ovens ran on injected steam. A commercial bake chamber holds it at 212 degrees under pressure, and the release lever is a heavy brass handle at chest height on the left side. And Nora Bennett had opened that lever 9,000 times in her life without thinking about it once. He came fast, and she was faster because she had been standing in that exact spot since she was 14 years old, and she did not have to look. The scald took him across the face and the throat. He went down screaming into her flower bench with both hands over his eyes, and Nora, who was not a bystander and would never again be a bystander, hit the walk-in cooler's door release, dragged 190 pounds of blinded assassin over the threshold by his collar, and through the outside latch. Then she sat down on the floor beside the mixer and shook for 90 seconds. Then she stopped shaking and picked up the phone. Damiano arrived at 5:11 with Enzo and 4 men, and he came through the door with an expression on his face that Nora had never seen and would not want to see again. Something stripped, something with the manners burned off it. He crossed the kitchen in 5 steps and took her face in both hands and turned it toward the light, checking for damage, breathing like a man who has been running. "I'm fine, Nora. I'm fine. He's in the cooler. I turned the temperature up so he doesn't die in there, because we need him talking." Damiano stopped, stared at her. "You turned the temperature up," he repeated. "He's evidence." Enzo Marchetti, from the doorway, said something in Italian that Nora did not understand, and which she later learned was a very old expression concerning God and the terrible things he gives to men who have not earned them. The man in the cooler was called Cain, which was not a name, and by 7:30 that morning Enzo had what he needed, and what he had turned Damiano Vitale to stone. Because Cain had been paid twice, once for the alley on Tuesday, once for the bakery, and both times the money had come, through a chain of 3 shells and a construction local, from a man on the Vitale side of the table, Renzo Fontana, underboss, godfather to Damiano's dead brother's daughter. The man who had stood at Damiano's father's funeral with his hand on Damiano's shoulder and said, "Whatever this family needs for the rest of my life." Damiano stood in the middle of Nora's kitchen with a piece of paper in his hand and did not move for a long time. 29 years, he said. Nora didn't touch him. She had learned that much. Ask him the other thing, she said quietly. Ask him about the paper. And there it was. Because in 2013, when Bruno Provisions needed a courier who could move invoices between two families without either side asking questions, a man trusted in both rooms, they had used the same man. Renzo Fontana had carried the forged pages. Renzo Fontana had walked into Thomas Bennett's office with a clipboard and a smile and left 9 months of manufactured fraud in a filing cabinet. For a fee. From Cesare Bruno. Nora put a hand on the steel bench to keep herself upright, and 11 years of grief turned over inside her and came up as something else entirely, something cold and clear and patient. "He killed my father," she said, "and he's been eating at your table." Damiano Vitale looked at her, and for one moment the two of them were exactly the same person. "Then we'll set it properly," he said, "both of them, once." The reckoning happened on a Sunday in the private dining room above Bruno's restaurant on Salem Street, because Cesare Bruno was the sort of man who believed his own building was a shield. Salvatore Conti made the arrangements. A sit-down, 5 families, no soldiers passed the stairs. The old protocol, the one nobody could refuse without confessing to something. Cesare came because refusing would have looked like fear. Renzo Fontana came because Damiano had spent 11 days being so warm to him, so trusting, that the man had genuinely believed he had won. They sat him at Damiano's right hand. Of course they did. Nora came in last, in the oxblood, carrying a white pastry box. Cesare Bruno was 71, small, dry, with a fringe of white hair and the mild expression of somebody's grandfather. He watched her set the box down in front of him, and his eyes went to Damiano with mild inquiry, as if to say, "Is this a joke, and am I meant to laugh?" "Open it," Nora said. "My father made you one exactly like this, the week before you took everything he had." Inside was a cake the size of a saucer, chocolate, mirror glazed, with a single letter piped on the top in white, B. "It was his thank you gift," she said. "He sent one to every supplier he worked with. He believed in relationships. He believed if you shook a man's hand, you were in something together." She stepped back. "Yours went out on the 11th of March, 2013. 2 days later, Renzo Fontana walked into his office with your paper. The room's temperature dropped 10 degrees. Renzo laughed. It came out wrong. Damiano, who is this woman, and why are we, Enzo?" Damiano said. Enzo Marchetti set 3 things on the table, one at a time with great care. A photograph of a wire receipt, a phone recovered from a man called Kane, and a single sheet of freight manifests with 51 lines highlighted in yellow, prepared, formatted, and annotated by a baker from Calder Street. Salvatore Conti put on his glasses. The heads of 2 other families leaned in, and Nora watched the exact instant that Cesare Bruno's face stopped being anyone's grandfather. "You set my route," Damiano said to Renzo conversationally. "Tuesday the 14th, 4 men. They put 2 into me behind a bakery, and I lived because a woman you've never met decided I was worth the towels." He turned his glass a quarter turn on the tablecloth. "Then you paid the same man to go back for her. That is a fabrication, Renzo." Damiano's voice never went above the level of a man ordering coffee. 29 years. I would have given you Providence. I would have given you anything you asked for out loud. Renzo Fontana stopped talking and looked at the door and understood there was no door. What happened to him happened downstairs, and it happened quietly, and Nora did not watch, and she did not pretend afterward that she didn't know. What happened to Cesare Bruno was slower and, in every way that mattered to her, worse. They did not kill him. That was Nora's condition, and she had held to it through 3 arguments with a man who was not accustomed to conditions. "He buried my father under paper," she'd said. "Let him drown in it." So the freight manifests went to a federal task force, along with 11 years of wire records that Renzo Fontana's phone had helpfully preserved. Bruno Provision's banking relationships evaporated in 6 weeks. 2 of the 4 families at that table declined to renew anything with him. Because a man who forges another man's signature to a fraud is a man who will do it to you. And on a wet Thursday in October at 7 in the morning, federal agents walked Cesare Bruno out of the same restaurant in a raincoat someone had draped over his cuffed hands, past the cameras, past the neighbors, past the window of a bakery 2 streets over where a woman in a white coat was pulling the first tray of the day. Nora watched it on a phone propped against the flour scale. Grace Molina stood beside her with a cup of coffee going cold in her hand. "Say something," Grace said. Nora looked at the tray. 24 almond croissants, evenly browned, exactly the way Thomas Bennett had taught her when she was 11 years old and had to stand on a milk crate to reach the bench. "He'd have wanted these out by 6, she said, and then she cried, finally for about 4 minutes, and then she got back to work. Gerald Thorne pleaded to 2 counts and served 14 months. Eleanor Prescott's name came off a building. Camilla Ashford moved to Palm Beach, where the water is warm and nobody has heard of anybody, and she was not invited to the wedding. The wedding was in June, in the garden of the house in Winchester, with 200 people and no photographers and a security arrangement that would have embarrassed a small country. Nora wore ivory, cut close, unhidden. Margaret Bennett sat in the front row on a good day, one of the last good ones, and held her daughter's hand before the ceremony and said, clear as a bell, "Your father would have liked him. Your father liked anybody who ate." Salvatore Conti gave the blessing in Italian, and then, for her, again in English. Enzo Marchetti gave a toast that was 4 sentences long and made 3 grown men put their hands over their eyes. Vince Ricci cried openly through the entire ceremony and dared anyone to mention it. And when it was done, when the last car had gone and the lights were down to the yellow service lamps she liked, Damiano Vitale found her sitting on the kitchen step with her shoes off and her hands full of leftover cake. "They're calling you the baker," he said. "In the neighborhood. Not the wife. The baker. Should I be insulted? You should understand what they mean by it." He sat down beside her on a step that was not designed for 2 people, which is how they had done everything from the beginning. "There's a version of this where I found you and I saved you and you spent the rest of your life grateful. That's a bad story. It's the story everybody expects." He took a piece of the cake. "This one is better. In this one you knelt down in the rain when leaving would have been smarter. And 11 months later 4 families sat still while you read out a list of numbers. And the man who buried your father went out in the back of a car in his shirt sleeves." He looked at her sideways. "I didn't lift you anywhere, Nora. You walked up here in your own shoes and I moved out of the way. Bennett and Daughter still opens at 5. The awning is still green. She had it repainted the same color exactly from a photograph. There is a small brass plate by the door with her father's name on it and the years, and underneath, because she is her father's child and had a sense of humor about it, the words fully reconciled. The oven still run on steam. They looked at Nora Bennett and every one of them saw the same thing. Something soft, something slow, something safely beneath their notice. It was the last cheap mistake any of them ever made. The world will tell you that being underestimated is a wound. But in the right hands, on the right night, it is the only weapon nobody thinks to take away from you. If the story hit you somewhere real, hit that like button for Nora, share it with someone who deserves to be underestimated one last time, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens the next time somebody picks the wrong woman to laugh at. And tell me in the comments, when Camilla opened her mouth at that table, would you have stacked your boxes or would you have stayed?